What if 3 different earphones at 3 different price points from 3 different manufacturers were all chasing after the same essential goal? Not more bass, not more treble or excitement, just plain accuracy. Well, today I'm going to compare the CrinEar Reference, the IO Audio Cielo, and the Moondrop Blessing 3 Aqua. And while they all are a little bit different in subtle ways, they are very interesting. So stick around, and at the end of this video, you'll have an idea of which I think is the reference one, the most reference that is, whether or not spending more money gets you more sound quality, and which one I would spend my money on. So let's start by taking a quick look at each earphone. But before we do so, I do want to give a quick shout out to Matthew and the guys over at Bloom Audio. They were super generous in loaning me the CrinEar Reference and the IO Audio Cielo, so I really appreciate that, guys. Thank you very much. And they rock. If you need anything, go to bloomaudio.com and they will hook you up. So, to jump right in, we have the IO Audio Cielo. It's kind of a nice vented faceplate appearance. It's, I think, plastic, all plastic if I'm not mistaken, with a resin shell. All of these have sort of a custom molded, like, anatomical design to them. I really like all these IO Audio earphones, like the Sogno and the Valère and this one. They have these cool colors. This one's kind of a light to medium gray, and when you move it in the light, I don't know how much you can see that, but they kind of shimmer and change. It looks really cool. So that's that. It's comfortable. This is the largest of the 3. Then we have the CrinEar Reference. This is a similar teardrop shaped faceplate with the CrinEar logo on it, and I believe a bass port. And this one is all aluminum. It's got a little bit more of an anatomical shape to it, and it feels lightweight, but it's very solid. It feels very durable. I like the way this is machined a lot. And lastly, we have the Moondrop Blessing 3 Aqua. I actually think this is probably my most favorite in terms of attractive shell design. You can see that the light catches on those facets there. I hope you can see that. It's a very nice appearance. And then the actual shell is acrylic clear with a nice blue dynamic driver casing. It has a really nice appearance. So there's a little pop of color in there. So this is probably the smallest of the 3. This is probably the middle size, and then the Cielo is the largest. Of all 3 of them, I think the CrinEar is probably actually the most comfortable, but mainly because of the way the nozzle and the stem go in my ear. All 3 of them, for me personally, are perfectly comfortable. There's no hot spots on any part of my ear, and they all work really, really well. So I don't think there's really any issue for most people here. If you happen to have very small ears, maybe the Cielo is a little bit chonky. So depending on the fit and the style of your ear, shape of your ear, it might be a little bit less comfortable. But again, it's got a very smooth kind of custom anatomical design. So I think for most people, these are going to be within the realm of reasonable in terms of fit and everything. So let's jump right over here to these site descriptions here. So the IO Audio Cielo, this bad boy comes in at $1,000. So woof, that's up there. That's the highest price point on this list of IEMs here. This is 16 balanced armature drivers, so that's kind of crazy. Now this does come with a good assortment of tips, a nice case, and interchangeable connectors on the earphone cable. So that's nice. So that is the IO Audio Cielo. And then we have the CrinEar Reference. The CrinEar Reference has a really nice assortment of tips at different bore hole and dimensions and whatnot. So it gives you a nice way to tip roll and get the right tip that fits your ear and works well. It's got a nice little carrying case. It also has a cable with a right angle connector and 2 different connectors. I believe that's a balance connector and the 3.5 standard connector. This baby comes in at $350, and this one is a 2 dynamic driver, 3 balanced armature set. Lastly, we have the Moondrop Blessing 3 Aqua. This thing is 2 dynamic drivers and 4 balanced armatures. This comes in at about $350 as well. The challenge you're going to find with the Aqua is that unfortunately it's only available in Japan. I really wish they would release this in the United States. I even contacted Moondrop and said, do it, you need to do this. This is by far, without question in my opinion, the best Moondrop earphone ever made. Again, all 3 of these are very similar in their reference style tuning. I think because this is made only in Japan or released only in Japan, the value proposition changes a bit. It's a lot more difficult to get, and I was very, very fortunate. I had a friend, Mike, that was in Japan. He was very kind to get this for me, so I was very lucky. Most people are probably going to have a hard time acquiring this unless you're very fluent in Japan and don't mind paying tariffs and other things to get them shipped over from Japan. So that's just something to take into consideration. So you have the Cielo, which is $1,000. You have the Aqua, which is $350, but might be a lot harder to acquire. And then you have the CrinEar Reference, which is $350 and is readily available in the United States and many other areas. So that's an overview of all the earphones. Now we know that specifications are important, but they don't really tell the whole story. But before we get into the listening impressions, I do think it would be wise to take a minute and kind of explain to you what I mean when I talk about a reference style tuning. So What is a reference style tuning? Sadly, when people hear the words reference style tuning or neutral, they usually assume that means boring, lifeless, not very exciting. But really, that's not what it means. The goal of a reference style tuning is really to allow the music to be reproduced as faithfully as possible as it was recorded. Now, in professional audio with the mixing and mastering engineers, they need a baseline, and that baseline starts with a set of studio monitor speakers measuring perfectly flat in an anechoic chamber. And they rely on this baseline when they're making critical decisions when mixing and mastering your music. Of course, headphones and in-ear monitors can't just copy that frequency response. They're completely different acoustic systems. The studio has the atmosphere of the room acoustics as well as the sound interacting with your entire body. The in-ear monitor specifically bypasses that entire acoustic environment in your body and goes directly into your ear canal. Because of these differences, an in-ear monitor isn't trying to reproduce a perfectly flat measured response at your eardrum. Instead, what it's trying to do is reproduce the overall tonal balance and level of accuracy and precision that you'd expect from a studio monitor speaker in a nice studio environment. In other words, an earphone isn't trying to replicate the sound of a speaker exactly. Rather, it's just trying to reproduce the recording honestly, allowing all the details across the entire frequency spectrum to be heard naturally and without any specific area being emphasized over another. So with that in mind, let's see how all these earphones compare. Overall, really, all three of these earphones are remarkably close. In fact, I think we're in a time where we've gotten to the point of getting close to the limit of diminishing returns, honestly, when it comes to neutrality in earphones. So you have, starting with the CrinEar Reference, a very neutral response. Now, the CrinEar Reference tends to have a little bit more lower and mid-bass presence than the other two, so it gives a little bit more of a weight to the instruments and a full body quality to them, but it never really bleeds into the point of being warm or bloated at all whatsoever. And the vocal presentation and instrument presentation on the CrinEar Reference is probably my favorite because it really gives the most natural timbre and textural quality to the treble, so things just sound natural and clear. Now the Cielo and the Aqua are a little bit different in that they both come across as slightly brighter. Now with the Moondrop Aqua, you have a little bit more of the lower emphasis in the lower treble, which is somewhat reminiscent of the Etymotic ER4S or something like that. It's not completely to that degree, but it gives a little bit more prominence to that lower treble region, whereas the Cielo, while similarly bright compared to the CrinEar Reference, is a little bit more laid back in that lower treble region. At least the perception is that it's laid back, and you get a little bit more emphasis on the higher treble, just a tiny bit more air. Now, I'm stressing that all of these differences are very minute. Again, we're at the point of diminishing returns here. All three of these are remarkably close and surprisingly neutral. And what I really appreciate about that is that none of these rely on any sort of exaggerated boost in any frequency area to give the false perception of detail. Instead, all that detail retrieval comes from the fact that there's a good even tonal balance across the entire frequency spectrum. Not one area is emphasized over another. And what that allows is it allows your mind to focus on the recording and not be distracted by the tuning. So with that said, let's jump in and take a look at some of these frequency response graphs. All right, first, let's real quickly take a look at my frequency response target, the dent review target. So essentially, over the years, I've kind of geared this target towards what I believe is the most close approximation to that sound impression I get when I'm listening to studio monitors in the various music studios that I've been in with nicely treated rooms and good measuring responses. So this, to my ear, sounds the closest to that. Now you'll notice that even compared to other targets, such as the Harman target, my target's actually very similar. It's just not as aggressive of a tuning as the Harman target. And it's also very close in approximation to the IEF Neutral 2023 target and the CrinEar Treble target. The Etymotic is a little bit more bass light, so I believe that the target I've made has a little bit better approximation to a speaker like bass without getting into the realm of masking. So anyway, basically this is what I think is the best approximation of a neutral studio monitor sound. And it's not far from most other agreed upon neutral type sound signatures. So given that, let's take a look at each of these. The first thing you'll see when I pop these on here is the measurements really actually line up remarkably well with what I'm hearing. You can clearly see that there are small differences in some of these graphs. So if I hide the Cielo and the Aqua, and let's just take a look at the reference compared to my target. Compared to my Target, you'll notice it does have the most bass presence and mid-bass presence. In fact, let me actually hide the Target and let's compare it to the Aqua. So you'll see the Aqua has a little bit more lean bass there. Whoops. And then the treble of the Aqua is a little bit more up and down, but I think it does have a slight bit more like super high treble peaking maybe up in this 10K region. It does vary based on the tip you're using, but I think it is there. Whereas the Cielo, let me hide the reference for a second. The Cielo is almost identical to the Aqua. I mean, if you look at that frequency response graph, there are very minute differences. Again, I think that the Cielo and the Aqua, with different tips, when you tip roll and get them to sound as smooth as you can, they have remarkably similar treble. However, even though the treble is remarkably similar, there is a difference in the very high upper treble. I do perceive the Cielo as having a little bit more air and a little bit more extension, whereas the Aqua, on the other hand, even though it may not show as clearly on graphs, I believe has a little bit more of a lower treble prominence. You can more clearly see this when you compare it to the reference. So compared to the reference, if I make that the neutral target, see a little bit more in the 1 to 2 kilohertz region. It doesn't look like much, but it does give the lower treble a little bit more of a forward presentation, which I believe makes certain instruments and vocals maybe stand out a little bit more. But at the same time, because of that bass difference between the Aqua and the Cielo compared to the reference clearly has this extra weight and body to it. So both the Cielo and the Aqua can give a little bit more of a lean, more bright presentation. Now, compared to each other, I think they're remarkably close to the point where sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between them. But on the tracks that I can tell a difference, usually the impression I get is that the Aqua has a little bit more of that edemotic style lower treble presence, whereas the Cielo has a little bit more upper treble clarity, just a little bit more air. Now, it's a little bit odd because the graph may not imply this, but to my ears, if you're being incredibly critical, super minute differences, I would say the Cielo kind of gives off the impression of being a slightly more U-shaped earphone because it lacks the lower treble emphasis and gains a little bit in the upper treble, kind of takes the mids down a notch and gives it a little bit more of a U-shaped presentation. Again, remarkably close, but comparatively, that's how I would describe it. Whereas the reference gives sort of the more full body weight impression to the sound while having a more linear, smooth treble. So while it may not be as bright in the strictest sense, the linearity of the treble and the smoothness of that treble really lends itself to being a great smooth timbre. It's very clinically smooth and clear and what I would say transparent. Things sound the most natural on the reference to my ears. So what's impressive is just how closely all of these follow that same sort of general target. And these measurements really just reinforce everything we're talking about here, that they're really minor refinements rather than completely different sound signatures. So that really leads to one final question. Which is the best value? Starting with the iAudio Cielo, it's a fantastic earphone. Great reference style tuning. I love everything about it. But at a whopping $1,000, what does it do that these other sets don't do? And honestly, I hate to say it, not much. So that really drops this value proposition down a lot. Second, you have the Moondrop Aqua 3 Blessing, one of my favorite earphones of all time. Its problem is availability. Being a Japan exclusive, not only is it hard to get in the United States, but if you could get it, you'd have to pay tariffs and import duty, taxes, all that kind of stuff, which that really drops its value proposition down a lot. And that leaves us with the CrinEar Reference. Not only is it my favorite tuning and the personal favorite sound quality overall, but it's the easiest to recommend. Not only is it available widely everywhere, it's the cheapest price, and it's a high-quality reference style tuning that gives the most speaker-like experience. So, if your goal is the most accurate studio monitor-like presentation, I think the winner is the CrinEar Reference. And I think that'll also appeal to most average listeners because, unlike the other two, it has a little bit more of that lower and mid bass weight. And I think that a lot of people will appreciate that. Now, if you do like a little bit more of an edemotic style treble, lower treble, maybe the Blessing 3 Aqua is a little bit more your taste. Or if you really value that incredibly high treble extension articulation, maybe the Cielo would be your cup of tea. But what really surprised me is actually not how different these sound, but how similar they are. They're remarkably close, closer to each other than they are to most other earphones. So I would say that all three not only pursue the same target philosophy, but they all do a really good job at achieving it. And these are probably three of the most neutral studio monitor type earphones that I've ever heard. So if you enjoyed this comparison, I would love to know which one would you choose? Or is there another earphone that you think would compete well with these and should be part of this conversation? Leave me a comment below. And if you found this video helpful, I just ask that you please subscribe. Appreciate you guys. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned, and I'll catch you in the next video.